Greetings, Cap fans, and welcome to episode 82 of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Verbanis, and as always, I am joined by, some might say, the best gosh darn co-host out there. Hey, Bob. And you may find yourself living in a shotgun shack. And you may find yourself in another part of the world. And you may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. And you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife. And you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here?
That's like a cultural touchstone.
Yeah. Do you know what that's from?
That's Talking Heads, right?
Yes. What's the name of the song? What's the name of the song?
Burning Down the House.
Oh my God.
I don't know.
Completely
I hate that.
song.
I never liked that band, I have to say.
Oh, okay. The name of the song is Once in a Lifetime.
Yeah.
Once
in a Lifetime.
So Once in a Lifetime was on a live album that they created. And it was, do you know what that live album was called?
I have no idea.
Stop Making Sense.
Stop Making Sense.
Yes.
I do. Now, it does ring a bell.
Yes. You know why Stop Making Sense rings a bell? It was also the title to Captain America 307, which just happened to be the very first issue Mark Gruenwald wrote for Captain America.
I have to think this is all tied together in some way.
I know, right? Yes. So today we're going to be talking with the author of Mark Gruenwald and the Star-Spangled Symbolism of a Captain America from 1985 to 1995. So we're going to be talking with Jason Olsen, the writer of the book. And the book, of course, is all about Mark Gruenwald's time on Captain America. So I thought, what better opening to you, Bob, than to give tribute to the very first issue Mark Gruenwald wrote of Captain America.
Nicely done. And I hope maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk to Jason about that very thing, the use of the Talking Heads album.
Yeah. Gru was a big Talking Heads fan, so he actually titled a few of his stories after some of Talking Heads lyrics or songs or albums. So anyway, yeah, that's where we are. And we're going to be talking with Jason here in a few moments. But before we do, Bob, I just want to point out, we got another 5-star review on Apple, on iTunes. And, we're always appreciative of our listeners who leave us a 5-star review. And also you could do that on Spotify. And we also appreciate you just subscribing and just making sure that you never miss an episode.
Yeah. These reviews, it's like a deluge now.
You're right.
The expression on your face was priceless.
Because it's missing. It's one of those stupid things like what happens when you're on iTunes and you have something open and then you go back to it. It's like blank. It's happened many times. Yeah, that's right. I was able to get to it. Yes. So Bob, this 5-star review on iTunes is by someone referred to as Udlock. It's Udlock. Udlock. Let's go with Udlock.
Yeah.
Right. They gave us a 5-star review, and the title of it says, "Nice to have 2 Cap fan friends with me to wrap Cap on the way into from work." And he writes, or she writes, someone writes, "Great fun and very informative for the Cap comic book hobbyist and scholar. I found both the Facebook group and podcast last year and had to play catch up on all the episodes. I have at least a 30-minute commute to work each day, and after listening 5 days a week, I finally got all caught up in January. I now look forward to Wednesdays when each new episode drops. The episodes covering specific issues feels like Rick and Bob are reading to their kids before bedtime. Nothing better than story time with a healthy moral lesson with a "what would Cap do" message. Also, great insight on insider interview episodes. Bob, here's my favorite part of the review. You ready?
I'm ready.
One suggestion, though. Bob, come to class prepared, dude. You're a college professor. Set a good example. I'm a school administrator, so I get to say things like that.
Okay.
Actually, it's pretty funny when you don't, because it gets Rick really riled up. It is true. It does. Keep up the good work, Cap fans.
Awesome. Love it.
Yep. All right. So thank you, Udlock, for that 5-star review. And if you leave a 5-star review on Apple iTunes, we'll be sure to mention it here on the show. So be sure to subscribe. And also, one other plug. Make sure you check out CaptainAmericaComicBookFans.com. That's another way that you can go on and just, put in your email address. Every time a new podcast drops, you'll get an email and you can go right to our website and you can listen to it right on our website, or of course, wherever your favorite podcast provider is. Well, Bob, I say, hey, you know what? I'm excited to get to talk to Jason. How about you?
You bet. I've been waiting for this opportunity. I read through the book and I know he's waiting for us to let him into the room. So let's do it.
All right, let's get to Jason. Pretty much all Cap fans have heard of Mark Gruenwald. He surpassed Stan Lee as the longest tenured writer of Cap, writing the series from 1985 to 1995. And during that decade, he introduced such characters as John Walker, who was the super patriot, then became Cap, then became U.S. agent, the villain turned love interest Diamondback, and a slew of other villains from Crossbones to Flag Smasher to Scourge of the Underworld. And he penned such stories as Steve Rogers giving up the role of Captain America to be known only as the Captain. He wrote Bloodstone Hunt, Streets of Poison, and so many more. In addition, Mark was Marvel's executive editor, working on dozens and dozens of titles, including he was the mastermind behind the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Sadly, he died at the young age of 43 as a beloved creator and editor, and known as a generous, fun-loving jokester. Our next guest, Jason Olsen, has written a book diving deep into Mark's impressive decade as Cap's writer. The book's titled Mark Gruenwald and the Star-Spangled Symbolism of Captain America, 1985 to 1995. So we're very excited to get into the book and explore Gru's Cap legacy. So Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, before we get into your book, tell us a little bit about yourself, like how and why you first became a fan of Captain America.
Well, that takes us back a ways, doesn't it? I started reading comics in about 1985. I think I was 9 years old. And I remember the first comics I ever got. My mom gave me a whole handful of them to take to summer camp. And my summer camp experience was completely dreadful, but at least I had those comics. And I'd like to say that those were all Captain America comics to really create symmetry for our conversation. They were not. They were the further adventures of Indiana Jones. So I was still in the Marvel universe,
yeah, all right,
but not Cap. And I found Cap on my own a couple months later, as I got excited about every possible Marvel comic. For some reason, I was already partisan toward Marvel. I guess those great Indiana Jones adventures, and I found issue 307 at a newsstand, probably in one of those spinny things, and it caught my eye. For a couple of reasons, one of which it had the promise of a dramatic retelling of World War II, or dramatic flashback to World War II. And so I brought it home to my grandfather and we read it together. He was a World War II vet, and I didn't know it at the time, but that was Mark Gruenwald's first issue, as well as my first issue of Captain America. And so over the years that followed, my grandfather and I read a whole bunch of them together. And then like many of these stories about reading comics in the 80s and 90s, I kind of lost touch a little bit and then revisited comics in general and Cap and Gruenwald in particular when I started college, because there was a wonderful comic shop right across the street. And so it was such an easy way to lose any expendable income I had, even if it wasn't
lucky
that
man.
expendable. Yeah. And that got me back in there. And so at that point, I've got to the tail end of Mark's run. And I hit the Fighting Chance and the issues that followed that. And so then I kind of filled in the blanks on that with back issues. And then again, more time passes. And then I am going off to getting different degrees, and I've kind of lost a little bit of touch with the comic world. And I got married and had kids, and then I stumbled back into it again, and got into pop culture research and became very interested in the idea of kind of getting into something in a little more depth.
Wow. Well, I got to say, I think for me, that time period you're talking about, high school and college, and I think Bob agrees a little bit too, and many of the listeners, that's kind of a sweet spot, when it came to reading. And so we all have a love for that time period, right? Absolutely. When we first got into it. So a lot of readers absolutely, love Cap, right? So, and we've got thousands of fans in our Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group. But not everyone certainly commits the time and energy and resources to write a book on the subject. So what motivated you to write this book?
That's probably smart on their parts to not do that. What compelled me to write is, as I said, I was doing a lot of pop culture research. I was presenting at conferences and writing a little bit about some various things. And I was at a pop culture conference in Washington, D.C. in 2019. And I was at the book fair and chatting with some editors and staff from McFarlane and Company Books. And we were just talking about some pop culture type things. And after a little while, they said that if I had any ideas, that I should propose them and give them a chance to think about it. And maybe they were just trying to get rid of me, right? But it made me think, like, this could be fun to really delve into a pop culture topic. And I went back to my hotel room and I started thinking, and then these issues from Gruenwald came into my head. And I thought, these were such a formative thing for me as a kid. I mean, I don't know if there was a writer that I read more when I was a kid than Mark. I mean, just going through all those issues of Cap, and I would go back and I loved the Hawkeye stuff. I was reading Quasar. I was just reading a ton of his stuff. Mm-hmm. And I looked it up and I saw plenty of really cool articles writing about him and his legacy, especially on Cap, but there was nobody had done like the deep dive. And I thought, well, this might be kind of a fun thing to do. And I proposed it to the publisher, and they were on board. And so it was a big project, but I kind of plotted out the different issues. I read through everything again, and I love them as much now as I did then. And so then I started to see things that I wouldn't have seen, when I was even in high school. Some really interesting cultural commentary and political commentary that were working through these issues. And I came up with a list of things that I wanted to talk about. And then I just dove in. And it was a project that came together really very, very quickly. And I'm grateful to my wife and children for allowing me to have the time to do it. Because there were a lot of times just sitting at the kitchen table, just working through different chapters and coming up with ideas. But it was absolutely a project built out of love for the material. And I'm so grateful I got to do it.
Tell us a little bit about you're an academic, right? And what your academic background is and what you're doing now.
I am a associate professor of English at Utah State University. And I have a background, a PhD in English with an emphasis on creative writing poetry, and a secondary emphasis on different the 21st century poetry. My master's degree is also in creative writing. So my background is mostly in creative writing. I am currently working on a creative writing textbook that I'm writing that should come out in 2023, as long as I hit all those deadlines that I've said I would. I teach writing and literature, and my love of pop culture and comics works its way into my writing classes so often. And whenever I get a chance to teach it, I try. This summer, I'm going to be teaching a graphic novel course. And so I'm always excited to get to do that. So I try to weave those interests in pop culture and comics specifically into my teaching as much as I can.
I love hearing that because, I used to weave that into my classes as a student,
Mhm.
right? Like I used to somehow find a way to write about comic books in any of my English classes, and my English teachers, my English professors loved it because it was something different, right?
Mm.
Like it wasn't the same old stuff they were seeing all the time. In fact, I know in college I did a paper on comparing T.S. Eliot's Wasteland to Alan Moore's Miracle Man. And I got like an A+ on it, right? Because, it was something that they'd never seen before.
Wow.
But that's brilliant that you're able to intermingle, your two passions.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing time to get to do this, because unlike perhaps when we were in high school, comic characters are pretty hot these days.
Mhm.
It was hard to convince people of how cool Captain America and Iron Man were back when I was in middle school, and now it's less difficult. So like I would tell my students when I was working on this book, and they were like legitimately excited about that. And so it's really neat to be able to take those passions and then show them the application, like show the students like, hey, this is what I did, and show them that it's okay to follow the things you love, even in a setting that might not feel like it's totally compatible with it.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because, and I did want to bring that up because I think a lot of maybe our listeners don't realize that there's this whole field of pop culture and critical analysis, and that there's conventions and there's books and there's journals that address this. But let's get to the book. In the introduction, you asked the question, at what point should we stop regarding a work as a mere text and start thinking of it as literature? So what's the answer here? Why should we think of Captain America comics as a body of literature to be analyzed and critiqued, and from which we might be able to learn something deeper?
I want to talk, I'm going to answer this question, I promise, but I'm going to start us off by taking us back to my MFA thesis defense. I already said I got a degree in creative writing, so I had to sit in a defense with my advisor and other people. It's a horribly intimidating process as they ask you, just grill you question after question. And you know what, friends, I got through it. It was great. I got through it. I had a great conversation. My advisor, chairing this committee, said, well, I think if no one has any other questions, we can go. And I was, halfway out of the seat, ready to just get out there and go hang out with my friends and just, get through this. And then one of the people on my committee said, well, wait, I've got one more question. Just one more question. I'm like, okay, what is this? And
it's like Columbo, right? Exactly. Just one more question. Right.
He was an English department Columbo. And so Professor Columbo then said, so let's say that a student comes into your office to talk about poetry. And I'll use the example that he gave in 2001 here also. And this student really loved this poem that you assigned in class. Yeah, and the student also said that they really loved this song by Britney Spears that they just heard on the radio. How do you talk to them about how different these two things are? And I'll tell you what, you two, I bombed this question. I can't remember what I said. I'm glad there's no recording of whatever I said, because I'm sure it was terrible. I had a foot out the door of this room as I was answering this question. But it's a question that I've re-answered in my head 1,000 times. And I thought of it as you asked that question, because it's kind of living with this same principle. What's the difference between this sort of academically, critically praised work of literature with this thing that's created for popular effect? And I spent a little bit of time in the book. Earlier drafts of this book, I had a lot more time talking about this difference between literature and pop culture and where they meet. And ultimately, I wonder if it matters. And I say that knowing there's a distinct difference between Gruenwald and T.S. Eliot. I mean, there just inherently are going to be things. But one of the main differences would be the way we look at them critically. And as somebody who's written a lot about T.S. Eliot also and gotten into some pretty deep analyses of The Wasteland, I think one of the things that makes literature is its ability to bear scrutiny, how deeply we can get into literature and find things out of it. And as I was going through these issues of Mark's, they bared scrutiny. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of this. And so ultimately, I don't know if it matters what we look at, Shakespearean versus Gruenwaldian or anything like that. But what matters is what we can get out of it. So even if something was created for, an audience of some children and various types of audiences, which we can assume that The Wasteland, for example, was not. There is still so much that we can delve into with Mark's work that I think it fits into a definition of literature, because I think it gets tricky with comic analysis, because there might be certain things we'd look at and think, well, the Watchmen clearly is literature. And maybe there's certain things, maybe, the 1980 Star Comet Heathcliff line is not what we'd look at as literature. Maybe there's not a lot of scrutiny that can be delved into. But Mark's work kind of fits in the middle. It's clearly geared toward a popular audience. But goodness, if there's not a lot of meat inside those issues too. So I think if we love something enough and if we can talk about it enough, then things can be literature. And as you were hitting on, Bob, the pop culture academic scene is just so popular right now because there's so many things we can do. And I sort of joke about it. The one of the things I do in the scholarship is take things that we love and then suck all the joy out of them. And it was hard to do with these issues for me because I love them so dearly that I hope that gets conveyed. But yeah, I'm going to call it literature. That certainly justifies me spending this many words writing about it.
Right. Yeah. So one of the other I think foundational assertions you make in the introduction is you say that Mark Gruenwald's Captain America is very much a product of its era, both artistically and politically. And you make the case that it is, quote, completely aware of the political climate of the era, unquote. We'll dig into those claims a bit more as we go along, but generally speaking, what do you mean by that?
Mark's a writer that is very much aware of when he's writing, but it doesn't plaster itself over everything that he's doing. And so what's really interesting is there are these insinuations of the outside world that are going on politically that motivate the characters and the actions that take place. The Captain storyline, the road to the Captain, all the stuff that you have done such a wonderful job talking about over the last few months and will continue to do. There's no way you can read this and not think about the Iran-Contra stuff and think about ways in which the government was maybe not being as honest as it could have been during this era. And so I think that Mark is definitely tied into these things. He also does that culturally. There are all sorts of little cultural touchstones that are working their way through these issues. And so I think that Mark is very much thinking of these issues and Captain America as being part of this era. There are some comics that I could go back to them and think, well, this could have been taking place at any time. Maybe the drawings of the hairstyles and things, maybe that looks pretty 70s or 80s, but this could be any time. Mark's 10-year period had to take place between 85 and 95. And that's true of the stuff at the end too, because the sort of climate politically and certainly in the comics industry changed so much from 85 to 95 that the things that he's doing at the end of this feel like they only could have existed during that period as well.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about Capwolf?
I to a degree, yes. Because I had a chapter. I will say this, Rick, but I had a chapter about Capwolf and about Teen Cap that were in there that I ultimately decided to pull. And I know that's a disservice to all of us, perhaps, or perhaps it wasn't. You haven't read it. And I think some things that are interesting about Capwolf. I love it.
He's got his Cap. Rick's showing off his Capwolf T-shirt right now. Yeah,
I would reveal my Capwolf tattoo, but I'm not going to do that.
Please don't.
And I don't have one. But I think what Capwolf kind of gets at with the Wolverine guest appearance is these popular characters that are very, very different than Steve Rogers.
Yeah.
And in that series you get so many guest stars. There's some cool stuff in Capwolf. There's very little doubt about that. It gets a little diluted with the guest stars as it goes on. But there's an essence. What that chapter was, not that you asked me about that, but I'll answer it. What that chapter was that I ended up not using was taking the idea that there are a couple of storylines where Cap physically is changed, like into a teenager or into a wolf, whatever the case may be. And yet Steve Rogers is never gone. That even as a teenager, what that means is okay, he doesn't quite have the strength and he doesn't have the super soldier serum. So he's going to have to reason his way out of these situations. And as Capwolf, he can't communicate and think as clearly, but the Steve Rogers is still there. And I think that's such a wonderful thing that Mark does, is we never lose track of Steve, even when he's a wolf. Even as a wolf, he's still motivating all the other wolves to go in there into battle. And I just love that.
An inspiring wolf, yes.
He's one of the most inspiring wolves I've
absolutely. Hey, there's lots in this book that I got to tell you, there's things that I read and that I was like, yeah. I mean, I kind of knew that maybe subconsciously, but I never really put my finger on it. And one of the things was I noticed early on was early in the book, you argue, and I'm going to quote you again here. You said, Gruenwald realized something that became essential throughout his 137 issues. If Steve Rogers ever was a regular Joe at some point in his life, that part of him likely died years earlier. And what remained of that person was ultimately completely frozen completely out of him. And then later on, you wrote, one of Gruenwald's defining tropes on this title is his interest in figuring out where the symbol and the man separate and where they ultimately met. I mean, that's an insightful observation that cuts really to the heart of the characterization of who Steve Rogers is and who Captain America is. And is it the same person or isn't it? What did you mean by it?
Well, thank you for saying that. That makes me feel good. Like I got something across. That's awesome. I think that there's a closer proximity between Steve Rogers and Captain America than there are with most superheroes. And I think that's something that's really compelling. And I think it's something that Mark figured out it seemed pretty quickly within the series. Cap is also much more, Steve, I guess I should say, so much more aware of his status as a myth than a lot of other superheroes seem to be. That's not to say that he's more myth than, like, for the audience than other superheroes are, but his own sort of self-awareness. There's that weird story. It's in the 50th anniversary issue. I think it's 383. The Legendary America one, the one where Cap lands in some strange world and starts hanging out with John Henry and Uncle Sam and Johnny Appleseed. It's a completely bizarre story. And the whole story is about whether or not you are myth, or if you're a person, if you're a man. And Steve is unwilling to accept that he's passé, that he's ready to be just looked at as mythology at this point. And that's really an interesting thing, because the idea that for the reader, he's fictional and he's mythological and he's all of that. But within his own universe, within that Earth 616 of the Marvel universe, he's a living flesh and blood individual who probably gets a lot more criticism than we would have in our world as we look at him. And he is not willing to give up that humanity because he is so deeply tied to what it is. So I think that, but he's also aware that he is close to myth. Because of the way that he is perceived and the way that he carries himself. And I think that's fascinating, that how close. He also seems to be, he's protective of his secret identity because he's a Marvel character in the 80s and 90s, and they all were, basically. But he seems less concerned about protecting that secret identity than some, because there's almost no real gap between the two. I mean, it feels like they're very much the same, especially as it goes on. You know, it feels like maybe at the beginning there's a little more illusion of the difference between Steve Rogers and Captain America. But as it goes on, Steve is very aware that there's just not much space in between the two.
Would you say that the myth, when you talk about a myth, that it's similar to what an icon, or is that a different type of explanation?
I think that fits. I think that makes sense. I like using the word myth because it sort of stands almost as an imaginary figure as we would look at it. And so there's something that's almost within even his own universe, he wouldn't be seen as being quite human, where these other superheroes are much more human. And we see that in execution. We see other superheroes who have a very clear distinction between their secret identity and their costumed identity. And you've got characters like Hawkeye who are a little more casual, perhaps out of the uniform than Cap. So I think I would be fine with using either of those terms, right?
Or but symbol. I think symbol, probably is something that's been used quite often when referring to Captain America.
Yeah, I use it liberally within the book too. And because he sees himself this way, and that's a difference between a lot of characters like Cap would probably hesitate to be seen as a symbol, but Steve Rogers embraces that full on. He wants that because that's going to make his mission easier to convey, where other heroes, other Avengers would probably be much more reticent to do that, because he takes his role as symbol, as myth, so much more seriously, perhaps, than others do.
Yeah, I agree. So, getting back to Mark Gruenwald, he's been referred to lovingly as the continuity cop of the Marvel universe, right? He had this uncanny ability to remember the most minute details, and which, quite frankly, probably why he was so involved, or not involved, but the genesis came from the official handbook of the Marvel universe, right? And how he got the role as executive editor, and we talked about the introduction of your book. Towards the end of it, you wrote, quote, "While Gruenwald's adherence to continuity is rightfully applauded, he was uninterested in continuity merely for its own sake. What is most important for Gruenwald, and what makes him potentially troubling to some readers or critics, is that he's willing to disregard certain elements of the character's history." So what do you mean by this? And can you maybe give some examples?
Yeah, I think the most obvious examples would be things like, Cap is very staunchly not going to drink over the course of Gruenwald's run. And there are moments, I can't remember what issue it was, but there's one where he's having a beer with Sam right at the beginning of an issue. The very anti-gun approach that Gruenwald has for Cap over the course of this run can be very clearly contradicted by things that we would see in earlier, especially back in the war issues, because those were continuity issues that were really not important for Mark as far as building the character. And what mattered most was going to be the character building of Steve and Cap into what he wanted them to be. This being said, the continuity reputation is completely valid. It's kind of remarkable to think of just how brilliant he was in keeping everything connected. I always love to think about that issue 307 when editors were asking what he was going to do on it, because often when a new writer would come in, maybe not as much back then, but they'd maybe start with a cleaner slate, and Grunwald does none of that. And if they asked him, so what's your first issue going to be? Well, I'm gonna have Cap on a plane for a good chunk of it because he was in the UK in the previous issue. So we got to get him back. I'm like, oh, okay. What's he going to do on the plane? Well, he's going to sit there and he's going to take a nap. And well, what's the main action of the story going to be? Well, Nomad is going to fight a new villain. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So we're going to build Jack up and build Nomad up? Yeah, he's going to be the star of this one. So what are your plans with him? Well, we're going to write him out in about 6 issues. He's going to pretty much be gone. Because that's what he wanted to make sure that the continuity was maintaining itself. And it wouldn't have made sense to just write off Nomad in an issue or just completely dispose of Bernie. He cared about making those steps as we go through, and his ability to pull characters out of the seeming ether is remarkable. And yet when it came to the integrity of the Cap character, he did things that maybe could be seen as contradictory to what's there before without any explanation, right? I mean, there's not a footnote that explains why Cap was having a beer in an earlier issue under a different writer, because that was less important to him.
Right. And I think also along that lines of the whole drinking, was it Mark Gruenwald who retconned that his dad was an alcoholic? I can't remember.
I believe so. I think it was.
Yeah. So he obviously had a strong opinion on that.
Yeah.
But you brought up Jack, you brought up Bernie. These are characters in Steve's life, right? And so you make the case that Gruenwald made a concerted effort to kind of unwind the previous writers' efforts to humanize Captain America by giving Steve Rogers a private life. He had an apartment, he had a girlfriend, he had neighbors, real world jobs, like he was an artist. Mm-hmm. But in contrast, you offer that Gruenwald, quote, slowly pulls Steve Rogers out of faking a place in the real world. So can you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to think of Steve Rogers as having a normal job and having a non-super powered, non-adventurer girlfriend and circle of friends. And I think that as Gruenwald moves through this run, that it sort of made sense for him to focus on the adventuring and the avengering, I guess, a little bit more specifically. And so those characters, while he never writes them out completely, and Bernie maintains a presence through a good chunk of this run, that there was an interest in kind of seeing how else he could interact with the world. So when I kind of imply that these other writers gave him a more human side than Mark did, I don't know if that's necessarily what I mean, because I think Mark makes him human, but it's kind of what we were talking about before, that Steve Rogers is not an ordinary guy. And so he still has a job as an artist, but it is to draw Captain America comics, which is fascinating, right? I mean, the levels of meta that we start to get into are incredible. And so even his real world job relies on Captain America and his knowledge of everything to do with Captain America's physicality and movement. He gets a love interest as it goes on, but she's another adventurer. And so it kind of moves everything toward that direction as Mark goes on. And I don't think it sacrifices Steve's humanity. I think it just kind of pivots it into a world that he's more comfortable in. And so that's what I meant by faking it. Not that Steve Rogers couldn't pass off as a normal human person, but he might not, right? When we're looking at like Clark Kent, we see a kind of a dopey guy, the way that he portrays himself. And then we see Steve Rogers walking into Marvel Studios to hand in his pencil work. Of course, they're going to think, wow, that guy could be Captain America. Look at that guy. And I think that's a really fascinating part of what Mark does with this.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because, he does still personalize him, but I will maybe offer this as a kind of like Steve was a little awkward, a little dopey in that issue where he and Rachel go on their first date, right? Yes. Like he was so old fashioned and out of touch as far as the last time he'd gone on a date. So that was kind of a great Mark Gruenwald-esque story. Down to painting Steve in that regard. And then also some of the other things that you touched on a little bit. Like, I know when we were covering this in an earlier episode, Mark's the kind of writer that just throws thought bubbles into these secondary characters, just to paint an overall picture. And that was also something that was very obvious in that particular issue.
I love that about him. It's like everybody matters. When I teach creative writing, one of the things that I teach in fiction is that every character kind of has to have a want, a goal, something that they're striving after. And Mark gives it to everyone, to the point where it's almost perplexing at times. Like, why did I just hear what the hot dog vendor was thinking at this moment?
Right.
And yet it feels like it fits into this world. I think of like Faulkner, when he was writing his work, would have backstories, like huge backstories for every single character that shows up, whether they're a major character in a work, or if there's somebody just taking a ticket to walk into an event. And I'm not saying Mark was necessarily doing that, but those thought bubbles give us that sort of credibility of this being such a living, breathing world that Captain America is part of.
One of the things that you credit Gruenwald for is his lack of concern, or apparent lack of concern, over maybe perceived as dated, because of the cultural touchstones that he sort of sprinkles throughout the stories. That was another insightful observation that I hadn't quite put my finger on, but when I saw the examples that you wove together in the text, I thought, oh my gosh, you're right. I mean, I do remember all those cultural touchstones when I was reading these back in the 80s, right? And so can you share a few of those with the listeners and explain a little bit what you meant by that?
Absolutely. One of the first things you can do is start Googling some of the titles that he comes up with. And there is a lot of Talking Heads references in a lot of the titles that he provides. And so right away, we're getting to see some of the cultural touchdowns. There's that issue where he and Bernie go to like the Farm Aid type concert festival, and he's seeing all of these different musicians. And there's that wonderful moment where he's like, where Cap says, is that Tina Turner? Or is Cap starstruck by seeing Tina Turner? This is that sort of awkward humanity that we talked about a second ago. There's a lot of references like that. Later on, Free Spirit, I think, mentions her heroes, or Michael Stipe and Mother Teresa and Captain America. And so he was just unafraid to put stuff that he liked in these issues. And I've had a chance to get to know Catherine Scholler, Mark's wife, and we've talked a little bit, and she said that he was just crazy about the talking heads, among other things. And it's been fun to kind of get a sense of that, because he just puts it in there. And I love that in a writer. I love when you get a sense of a writer's personality and the things that they like and the things that they care about. And Mark really puts that front and center, even though this is in no way autobiographical and it's not anything like that. There's just so much of him that seems to be in these issues, and it's kind of a delightful move. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it feels dated now. I sometimes, especially when I was deep into the book, my son would want to read them with me, and he's 6. And I'd have to explain things like, well, Tina Turner was, for some reason, he didn't know who she was. I failed as a parent, clearly. But it's really interesting how willing he is to keep things dated. And I think it's to the benefit of us as we look back at them.
Right. Well, it's funny you should say that, because, a lot of times we see a president that is in a story, but it's shaded, or mm-hmm. it's the back of the president's head, or because they don't want to necessarily date that story, right? But Ronald Reagan was clearly in Mark Gruenwald's story, right? When the Viper came with the turning in everybody into reptilians, and here we have Steve Rogers fighting a reptilian Ronald Reagan in the White House. I mean, yeah, he wasn't afraid at all.
Not everybody would have done that. And I think it's just such a wonderful moment. Yeah, you're right. Looking back at like Englehart's Secret Empire, for various reasons, that president remains shaded during that storyline. And so it's interesting to kind of think about how we see Reagan drink the tainted water that turns him into a reptile. And it's a wonderfully weird moment that Mark provides so many moments like in those issues.
Yeah. Let's touch on that a little bit more, shall we? I mean, you spend quite a bit of time in chapter 2, which is entitled Captain Un-American, Steve Rogers and Positive Patriotism. Mm-hmm. And you spend time differentiating the Captain America of the Englehart run from the one that emerges in Gruenwald's. And contextually speaking, of course, Englehart and Gruenwald are writing in and for 2 very different eras, the Nixon and the Reagan eras, respectively. Can you tell the listeners what some of those key differences are and how these shape the author's respective approaches, especially around how Captain America embodies this idea of patriotism?
Sure. I think one of the major differences is that when Nixon was under his deepest amount of scrutiny, deep into Watergate, the public opinion against him was catastrophic for his long-term success as president. Everybody had turned against him. People lost complete trust in government. And in Reagan, during the Iran-Contra affair, people did not trust Reagan. There's some amazing polling that I found that showed that barely anybody believed Reagan when he talked about the Iran-Contra affair. But he still had pretty large amounts of support. So there was like this cynicism that was starting to come in that maybe we didn't get as much during Nixon. It was almost like the Nixon scandals soured the country on the sort of just default respect they would have for the office of the presidency. And by the time we get to Reagan, it's like, yeah, he's lying, but everything, the things seem to be okay for some people. And so there was a less pushback on it during that time. And I think that educates both of those stories, that the Englehart story is, there's a really interesting letter to the editor in the Gruenwald era where somebody accused the 2 storylines being exactly the same. And the editor, was it Macchio, I think?
Macchio, yeah.
Yeah. Argues that point, and I think really splendidly, saying that the difference is in the Secret Empire, when Steve becomes nomad in that storyline, that was him kind of rebelling against everything. He was rebelling against the government. He was rebelling against the people. He felt that they had lost faith in him. He had lost faith in them. Steve's in a terribly dark place at that point. In the Gruenwald story, it's different. He hasn't lost faith in the people at all, but he has lost faith in the government. In fact, I mean, he's so determined to make sure he serves the people. He is not comfortable with the concept of being tied too much into governmental red tape. And so I think that that's reflecting these different times, is that people were cynical, but they weren't completely disenchanted, because perhaps that disenchantment had already occurred in some ways. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, because you go on and you close that chapter by suggesting that ultimately Cap's decision to stop being Captain America is a remarkably patriotic act, and you go on to assert that it's probably the most patriotic act that he undertakes during the entire Gruenwald's run. Is that why? Because he still, in your view, he still believes in the American people. It's just he's suspicious of the powers that be.
And rightfully so. I mean, it turns out that the powers to be are under the control, at least to somewhat, of the Red Skull. So Cap's spot on in this assessment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And we've talked about how Steve Rogers and Captain America are so deeply intertwined. And so what could be more difficult for him to do than to give up that uniform and that shield? Because that's something that he's saying is identifying to him, to the mission that he has and the mentality that he possesses. And so to sacrifice that is a massive, massive sacrifice. And he worries, and the main thing he worries about is that, well, that means somebody else is going to wear it. And what if they do a disservice to this uniform and the shield? Because that's how deeply entwined he is with it. And so I think it is patriotic, because he's willing to overcome those concerns, to give up this thing that is defining to him, because he knows it's for a greater good. And I think that that's a fascinating thing. And I think it is a deeply patriotic act. So I stand by that. I like that. I'm glad I wrote that.
We stand by it too.
Thank you.
So a good part of your treatment of Gruenwald's run explores the contrast between Steve Rogers, Captain America, and that of John Walker. So first, tell us a bit about why Gruenwald introduced Walker as Super Patriot and then gave him the Captain America mantle for a year and a half. And what was going on at the time, both, culturally, politically speaking, that, may have influenced Gruenwald's creative impulse here?
I think one of the first things that Mark does is introduce these characters, these villains especially, that are ideologies. And so one of the things he was kind of interested in is, like, if Captain America is patriotic, then does that mean patriotism is innately good? And he started to push back a little bit on that. And like, well, what if we had a darker side of patriotism? What would that look like? Well, it looked like the Super Patriot, right? This character who feels disingenuous, who is using his patriotism as sort of a contest to show how much better I am than you at this. And so the Super Patriot debuts, I think, to provide a darker aspect of patriotism. To contrast with Steve's very uplifting and positive patriotism, we get this very negative view of patriotism. I think it's also telling just the way that the character is conceived and the way he looks. He's very Dolph Lundgren, Rocky IV, right? Which totally fits into the timeline. That's from 1985. Yeah, and so we're right at the timeline. And so we've got this sort of I will break you type figure who appears, to contrast with Steve, who looks a lot more like maybe let's see, who would be a good match for him at this moment. Robert Redford, right? Who's got kind of a Robert Redford vibe. Who was in movies like Out of Africa in 1985. And so it's sort of like looking at this sort of this aggressive figure versus this more thoughtful one. And so I think that one of the things that also inspired Mark, and he said this in an interview that I found, that fans were sort of asking him to make Captain America more like Rambo.
Yes.
And Steve Rogers, as he says, could never be Rambo. There's no way I can do that, but I'll give you that. And so he brought in Super Patriot and John Walker to fill that void. So here's this Dolph Lundgren Rambo looking figure to fill that void. And it works as a contrast. We see how that kind of figure, this character with a different perspective on the government, at least at the beginning, much less cynical, willing to believe anything, versus Steve, who is coming at it from a much more thoughtful perspective. And so it's really interesting to see how that darker side of patriotism kind of manifests itself when it has the uniform on too. And spoiler, not always great. I want to give away everything that happens in the Captain storyline later.
I know that's our job when we go through our eight-part series.
Right. John doesn't always make the right decisions.
Yeah.
We'll just say that.
I got to say, I'm so glad you brought up because I've read some interviews where Mark mentioned the Rambo character.
Yeah.
Because it was, I mean, like here we are in the mid 80s, and to your point, Rocky, Rambo, these Sylvester Stallone type of macho patriotism, and I think that was also part of the reason that we've got the flag smasher with Ultimatum and Cap taking the machine gun and using it, and then the whole discussion about that, and also to Mike Zeck's cover of that issue where Cap's holding the machine gun looking like the Punisher. Like the Punisher was huge back then too.
What?
Right. I mean, that he was at his height. So I'm glad you brought all that up because Mark Gruenwald got Steve Rogers.
Yes.
And he wasn't going to bend to the whim of what the pop culture was at that time. He did his best to stay true to Steve's character and at the same time write this amazing story showing that Steve's going to be, tried and true and stay through this, even though you've got this other type of Rambo type character coming in as John Walker. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, thank you for making those points. I think that it's really interesting also to see how his perspective on that sort of evolves, because I think it becomes much more cynical, perhaps, as we get to some of the stuff that happens toward the end. And perhaps we'll talk about that if we get to conversations about fighting chance and some of those things. But I think that the comic industry changes so much by the time we get to the mid 90s that it isn't enough to just make commentary about it. You have to kind of question where Cap fits in at this point. The sales are going to be lagging behind titles like Punisher and the X titles and all that. And so it becomes a question of Captain America's value in the world at those points too. I think at this stage, it's not. I think at this stage, Steve is very convinced of what he's providing. But I think that it really works to have that contrast with John Walker.
I don't want to quibble though, but I do think the Rambo of Rambo 2 First Blood is very different than the original Rambo. And,
yes.
The original, which was very formative in my development as a young man. So
it's amazing how Stallone made sequels in which he forgot what the original movies were. He seemed to do that a couple of times.
He did that a few times, right? Yeah. So I want to apologize in advance to the listeners, but I do think this is an important point, and but it is a bit academic. So you contend in chapter 3 that Walker's approach to patriotism is a quote sort of aggressive response to the worldview of cosmopolitanism.
Sure.
And that rings true. And we often talk about this idea of a cosmopolitan view of patriotism, particularly around Steve Rogers. And his view that the American dream is it's not just a nationalistic response. It belongs to everybody equally at all times and all places. But, for the sake of listeners who may not be familiar with this term, can you explain what you mean by cosmopolitanism? Because you're not likely to hear that in everyday parlance, right? You hear it maybe in a classroom, political, science or political philosophy, but it's not something we talk about at the water cooler. And then can you share a bit of your thinking about how this idea relates to your assertion that Steve Rogers embraces a somewhat cosmopolitan perspective when he prioritizes the interest of humanity over the interests of nations?
Sure. I think that there are a few different ways to define cosmopolitanism, and I'll kind of keep it simple here for the sake of our discussion.
But and for me.
Fair enough. I think that it's
Rick's just thinking of is this the magazine?
Yeah, it's the one where they have like
how to keep your man, how to get your man. Is that the right? Yes. No, okay.
In Utah, they have the nice little black barriers in front of it, so you can't put on the cover in newsstands. Cosmopolitanism, I think one way to think about it is that it's the people are there The nation is there to support the people, and it's not necessarily the people supporting the nation. And I think that works as there's more nuance perhaps to that, but I think that's the way I kind of want to distill it right now. Where it's where a place where John and Steve really stand in contrast with each other, because that deep trust that John Walker has in the government to steer him in the right direction, which dissolves as his storyline goes on. But it's kind of built on the idea that the country is here for the people to do right for it. That it's the country that matters. That's the entity that we're all here to contribute. That we're here to benefit this thing. Where the cosmopolitan perspective is that, well, people are what are most important, and so there's really less value to the state as there are to the people that are within the state. And I think that's closer to what Steve thinks. But Steve is not anti-nationalism. We get that through the whole Flag Smasher storyline. That Flag Smasher is there to talk about how the world would be so much better without any borders at all. And Steve's not there for that, because he sees value in nations representing people, but he's certainly not there to see the nation is the end all for it. Even his nation, even the one that he wears very proudly in every part of the uniform, even that is only as important as the individuals that it serves.
I think that clears it up. Thank you very much.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a complicated concept, but we do bring about it. We do talk about it quite a bit. So I think thank you for clarifying that.
Rick, are you still with us?
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, good. He's back.
So, later on in the book, chapter 5, actually, you write about Gruenwald's efforts to de-emphasize Cap's World War II origins in order to focus on the changing world of the mid-1980s to 1990s. And later on, you write that Gruenwald doesn't let Cap dwell in the past. And again, this is another thing that, when I read that, I said, reflecting back on the Gruenwald run, I'm like, yeah, that's something I hadn't quite noticed, but it rings absolutely true. But let's drill down into that a bit. Can you explain what you mean by this and maybe give some examples?
It's especially clear when you read the entire run. When you read some of the stuff that precedes and some of the stuff that comes after, it's sort of an anomaly in how little it actually talks about World War II. That doesn't mean it doesn't. It just pretends it doesn't exist, because that's not what's happening at all. But in that very first issue of Gruenwald's, he has the dramatic flashback to the invaders and World War II. And then for the most part, it isn't really mentioned. And when it is mentioned, it's significant, it's substantial. There's a moment where he finds all of the dead supervillains at the bar with no name, and he has a sort of a flashback where he thinks that I haven't seen anything like this since the war. And so there are these moments where it's almost like a PTSD sort of hits him of things that he's maybe been holding back. And so there isn't a lot of it. And when the skull is reintroduced, which was inevitable that it would happen, right? The skull is not wearing the green smoking jacket kind of get up that we see in earlier incarnations. He's totally Gordon Gekko, Wall Street greed is good by this point. And so even he is not really dwelling on World War II at this point. That
was another Gen X reference you just did, by the way, just for those who may not get Wall Street, but
what I'm here for. But that's not to say that there aren't other characters who aren't fixated on World War II, because when we get the Acts of Vengeance storyline and Magneto confronts him, Magneto's thinking about World War II, friends, in pretty dramatic ways.
Yeah.
And when we get the Shea Stadium skivvies battle between Kingpin and Red Skull, Kingpin suddenly is a patriotic hero during this battle, which is sort of a weird role for him to fill. And he calls him a Nazi scum repeatedly, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are characters who are thinking constantly about this, but Steve isn't necessarily. And either is the Skull. The Skull is kind of moving into a different philosophy and a different perspective. Still a fascist, still a horrible, horrible character, but kind of pivoting a little bit away from that, at least directly.
So I'm glad you brought up the Red Skull, because you devote several pages contrasting Gruenwald's characterization of the character and how he's betrayed by previous writers in the series. Can you give us some examples and tell us, why Gruenwald, why would he take this approach to such a well-established character?
I think that's a great question, and I think that it kind of gets back to Gruenwald's overall approach to villains, and how they sort of represent different ideologies. And Skull is representing fascism, but the fascism that's going to be relevant to a 1980s, 1990s audience is going to be a lot different than perhaps it would have been in the 40s, right? And so I think he's kind of making that pivot toward this. Just the overall idea of World War II in 1990, just for instance, it didn't have the same cachet as it would have in earlier generations. There was another war that media and literature was more fixated on in the 80s and 90s, and that was the Vietnam War. There's a resurgence in interest in World War II with films in the late 90s and things like that. But we're in an era in which there just a saturation of Vietnam films and literature. Marvel even had the Nam series. And so there was a desire, a need to sort of pivot away from that a little bit. And I think making the Skull less a representation of an era that might not resonate with the audience and into something that would, I made the Gen X reference to Wall Street earlier. And I think that makes him kind of more terrifying to that audience than he would have at other points. Instead of living in a castle out in the middle of nowhere, he's overlooking the city that he wants to destroy in DC. And that makes him kind of a terrifying character in a brand new way without losing any of the evil of that character. Right. He's still terrifying, but he's terrifying in a new way. And it's kind of impressive that Mark was able to do that, to reboot the character in this way without losing any of that. In fact, I think he's probably more scary in a way. You go back and look at some of the speeches and some of the earlier incarnations, and it's just these random spewings of words that the Red Skull is providing. Revenge, vengeance, killing, and lots of dots, lots of just random words. He's much more calculated by this point. And I think that makes him a more of an 80s, 90s nuanced villain, as much nuance as the Red Skull could ever have.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that out because Gruenwald did that with the Skull. And I would say probably in the same way that maybe Steve Englehart did that with Cap, right? Like where he took this long-standing story of here's a Cap removed from World War II, man out of time, pining for Bucky Barnes, oh, woe is me, into a different type of character. And I think Gruenwald did the same thing with the Red Skull. And then, you talk about this in your book in chapter 6, that, all these different adversaries, right? And how they really more defined Cap, right? Yeah. So, there's this, you make the case that many of his adversaries are specifically intended to, and quote, define Cap as the character Gruenwald wants him to be. So in other words, you write, Gruenwald uses antagonists in the title, not merely to create tension and action, though that certainly occurs, but to give the reader and Captain America himself a better understanding of what he personally represents. And then you gave 4 examples. So we talked about the Red Skull, but in previously we talked about Flag Smasher, but you also then go into Viper, you go into Batroc to make your case. So maybe can you summarize this argument for us?
Absolutely. This is one of the more exciting things I got into. I love talking about these villains. And it was really interesting as I'm delving into the issues, because this is something that Mark is doing in year 1. The first 12 issues of this, he's introducing a bevy of villains, or reintroducing villains that are ideologically driven, right? That they're almost exclusively built around one concept. That stands in contrast to something that Cap's doing. And there was pushback from readers. It's like, hey, I thought this was Captain America. And, he's barely in some of these issues, as we already talked about with the Nomad-centric issue that he started with. And it's true, but it's a long game. Mark knew that he wanted to be on this title for a while, and he was. And so it was a long-term goal to build out these ideologies and how they contrast. And as we've already talked about, the skull stands as a symbol of fascism and sort of 80s decadence and never-ending evil. And Flag Smasher stands here as this idea of anti-nationalism, which is a concept that the reader could potentially see as being valuable, but he is so violent, so murderous that we're not going to sympathize with him. But there's merit perhaps, in some of his ideas. The Viper is a nihilist, right? The Viper just wants to destroy. Just whatever can be destroyed needs to be destroyed. And so it's fascinating when you get that pairing of Viper and Skull as the run goes on. And two characters that you would think, oh, these are characters that will hit it off in ways that I don't even want to think about. And yet, Mark gets us to the point where, like, no, they're not compatible in terms of their ideologies, because, and the Skull actually lays this out, she's a nihilist. And her plans are so that if any of them ever worked, the world's over. I mean, everything's done if any of her plans worked. And that's why she's always stopped, because there wouldn't be much Captain America stories to tell if the Viper ever succeeds. And so there's that moment where the Skull says, like, he kind of admits that he's impressed with her, but I can't support a nihilist, because then what am I going to rule over if her plans ever succeed? And so it's that kind of contrast between the two. And Batroc's interesting because he stands apart from these characters, because we've got Viper and Skull are just so ridiculously over the top evil. And then you got Batroc, who doesn't feel as stereotypically evil as this. Even at the point of, like, maybe Flag Smasher has an ideology, but his use of violence and how willing he is to murder kind of make him stand apart from Batroc too. So Batroc represents what I talk about in the book as the masculine honor code. So this idea that he has this honor code that he abides by that is problematic in its own ways, but sort of represents something outside of Steve himself too. And so for Batroc, like, there's during the Bloodstone Hunt series, they find, he and his compatriots, they find Diamondback, and they just, his compatriots just want to kill her. And he's like, no, she's a lady. We have to be respectful to this lady. It's condescending. It's a little icky, but there's like this sort of sense of morality almost that's there, some sort of moral code. When he sees later in that storyline that Cap is about to be eaten by sharks, he doesn't feel like this is a proper way for a hero of as much dignity and value as Captain America to go. So he secretly saves Cap. So even though his allies can't see it, but then they confront him later and accuse him of being, I think the term is sweet on the captain, I believe is what they say, something like that, to which he blows up, defending his heterosexuality and everything else. It kind of explodes in that moment. So getting into the sense that this masculine honor code also has homophobia sort of attached to it within this. And so you would see Cap as being this sort of a symbol of nobility in this way too, but then we're also seeing the darker side of that through him. So yes, Batroc sees himself as this kind of gentleman, but at the same time, he's really not. Even if he's a little more noble and less murderous, perhaps, than some of Cap's other adversaries.
Yeah, then we come full circle at the end of Gruenwald's run. When Cap is laying there, thinking he's dying, right? Mm-hmm. And he's hoping to. One of the last things that he hopes to do is to convince Batroc to go on the right path.
Yes. And
Batroc, to his nobility, if you will, just try to acquiesce, Captain as he's on his deathbed, so to speak.
I don't know of many other writers who would have ended a major storyline in a run with Cap and Batroc having tea. Also, right? I mean, it's kind of
right. Yeah.
It also comes after he went and talked to Crossbones to see if there's some way of finding redemption. That's not going to happen. Right. That's not a character that's going to be redeemed. And so this conversation with Batroc happens, and it's a kind of wonderful, quiet moment. And Mark is so good at those. Some of my favorite moments in these comics are these kind of quiet conversations, as opposed to the action sequences, which he does splendidly as well.
Mm-hmm. So, sort of building on this theme, one of the things, or we've talked about it back in the late 80s, early 90s. There was this sort of anti-hero craze. Obviously in pop culture, we had the Stallone movies, we had the Schwarzenegger movies, and so I was fascinated by your suggestion, because and at surface level, it appears to be something different. I will just preface it with that. But I was fascinated by your suggestion that Gruenwald's use of both the Scourge of the Underworld and the Americop had less to do with capitalizing on that anti-hero craze that was so prevalent at the time, and more to do with solidifying Cap's character in contrast to those who had far more ambiguous moral codes. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Again,
because I think a lot of people would say, oh, wow, they just threw these in there because that's what everybody wanted. But there's something more there, right?
I think there is. I think if these were characters in other books or in their own books, they'd be viewed very differently. Both Scourge of the Underworld and AmeriCop are going after reprehensible characters, right? I mean, they're going after criminals. There's a code, especially that Scourge seems to have, and we don't want to get deep into the mythology of what the Scourge of the Underworld actually is. So we'll just kind of let it sit on what it is in those early issues of, somebody who sort of decided to take out this path of vengeance, as opposed to some of the convoluted stuff that follows. But that character has an honor code too. That character is unwilling to kill Cap because Cap's not a criminal. Cap is, I believe the quote is, one of the best crime busters there is, or something like that. Unwilling to take Cap out at those moments. But in contrast to Cap, he looks like a villain. In contrast to Cap, AmeriCop certainly looks like a villain. And so they're reinforcing this decency and this sense of justice that Cap possesses by showing this very dark and violent and over-the-top version of it. AmeriCop's fascinating because when we see him apprehending criminals, if apprehending is the right word here, they're awful. There's the implication of sex trafficking in one, and then there's a hate crime going on in another. And yet, the amount of violence that's taking place in reaction to those things is sort of appalling for the reader. Now, as we kind of got at before, would that feel as appalling in the pages of Punisher or in the pages of another type of comic? Maybe not, but that's not happening in another comic. It's happening in Cap. And it kind of gets back to what we talked about a while ago with Wolverine guest starring in the Man and Wolf series, that Wolverine is kind of a tough fit in some ways in the Cap universe because his sense of justice is very different than Cap's. And so Gruenwald solves that problem by getting to have Wolverine on the cover, but having him like mind controlled. So we don't have to really worry about what his actual decisions would be in the storyline. And with characters like AmeriCop and Scourge, they are villains because of the world they're inhabiting. Because this is Cap's world. And in Cap's world, you don't do the things that they do.
Yeah, until we get to annual number 8.
Yes.
Right, where we have Cap and Wolverine, and we get to dive a little bit, deeper into that. So that was a fun story, and I think that annual 8 ends with Cap telling Wolverine, "You'll never make it in the Avengers," or something to that effect. And then, of course, 20 years later, Brian Michael Bendis gets Wolverine into the Avengers.
Jason, Streets of Poison, Fighting Chance, you cover them both in chapters 9 and 10. And you suggest that it's a consistent trope of Grunwald's that he wants to make clear. And to do this, I want to paraphrase that famous quote from Iron Man, right? Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where he tells Cap, Steve Rogers, that everything special about him came out of a bottle. And I think Gruenwald, as you suggest, makes the case again and again that's not what's special about Steve, right? That it's Steve's work ethic that makes him special, that makes him Captain America. It's not the super soldier serum. It's not anything else. It's Steve himself. So what do you mean by that?
In that Streets of Poison series, when Cap gets the designer drug merging with the super soldier serum, that's the only time we really see a different version of Steve over the course of this. I spoke earlier about the Cap Wolf series and about the teen Cap, where he's physically changed, but he remains Steve Rogers. And here it's different. And so to rectify that, he's willing to lose the super soldier serum at that point in the storyline to make sure that he is still Steve Rogers and is willing to kind of move past the super soldier serum and see if he can still be the person that he knows he is. In the Fighting Chance storyline, when his body is physically failing him at those moments, he has to figure out how to work within that. And so Cap is learning pretty dramatically that he can't just do everything that he's done before. It's that person within has to be the one to carry the day. And those storylines, I think, do a fascinating job of covering that. It's so interesting. We kind of talked about the cynicism, perhaps, of the direction the comic industry was taking by this point in the late 90s, and how Mark maybe didn't feel that people were looking at Cap in the way that they did before. Maybe there was a lack of value for Cap. Maybe he was thinking about that himself. I don't want to delve too deep into what he was thinking. I didn't have the good fortune to ever get to know him. But it feels like in that storyline, we've got a Cap who's like physically removed from being able to do what he wants to do. Yet he still tries. And he has to find ways of surviving and thriving and trying to defeat villains, even though he physically is incapable of doing what he does. And that feels so Steve, to find ways to still fight when I cannot move. So how can I beat these guys if I'm actually physically unable to move for the next 10 minutes? What is it that I can do to try to defeat them? So to me, that really defines who he is. There's this persistence, this decency, this unwillingness to ever stop, that defines Steve Rogers and Captain America. And I think those storylines get that across.
Yeah.
Especially go ahead.
Oh, no, and you're right. I mean, very, very explicitly that you're right. Steve Rogers is great. And that's why Captain America is great.
Yeah.
Love that. I think that summarizes it, right? I mean,
it
does.
Drives
it home.
That totally drives it home, wraps it up very well. So Jason, you've spent a lot of time in this book exploring Mark Gruenwald's run. It's clear you have a lot of love and admiration for Gru as a person and as a creator. But hey, is there one story you could point to that Gru wrote that is maybe perhaps the most meaningful to you, and why?
Gosh, I don't know if I can, Rick. I might mention a couple because as a complete cop out, but I'll at least come up with two that are next to each other.
That's fair.
Thank you. That probably a lot of people aren't going to pick, but I delved so deeply into it. I'm going to take some issue 400 and 401. That's the Operation Galactic Storm storyline, which I didn't really, I couldn't find a lot of love for the storyline, and so I'll provide all of it here. But issue 400 and 401, they're like two places in which I feel like that you almost get this best understanding of how Gru wrote this character. Because in 400, it's basically a Cap story, solo story, even though it's in the midst of this huge crossover, in which he's kind of captured by the Kree and is forced to fight his greatest villains from the Gruenwald era all at once. And he's not sure if they're real or not. And that's the whole conceit of the story. So he's fighting, I believe it's Skull and Batroc, Crossbones is there, Viper's there, I think Cobra is there. So he's fighting all of them at once. Yet the whole time, as he's fighting, and they're exciting sequences, well drawn and well rendered, he's thinking, how do I figure out if this is real? And so it's this fascinating approach to battle. It's not just, I'm not just going to try to destroy everybody here. It's like reasoning and trying to figure out. And it turns out that all of these characters are manifestations that are created by Steve's psyche and his memories and his understanding. And so these characters that are fighting him are completely created by him, which means that we get this other insight, which is what an incredible observer Steve Rogers is and how much he pays attention. So as these villains are about to kill him, Batroc doesn't feel like this is sporting at all. And so he saves Steve at the last minute. And it's not really Batroc, it's the way that he's perceived things. Mm-hmm. And then Steve is trying to figure out I got to know if you're real or not. And so can you take your mask off? And Batroc's like, well, you don't know what I look like. So what will that tell? And Steve's like, just do it. And then I'll see if my point is right. And he takes his mask off and there's no face. It's only the mustache and the bottom, because Steve has worked his way through an understanding of this fight sequence. And it's so much more interesting than just punches and kicks, because it's this cerebral approach that Gruenwald so instilled in the character. And then in 401, it's the aftermath. And it's Cap dealing with depression. And he's feeling that the Avengers are not responding to him in the way that they did. He's feeling that he's a bit of a failure. It's really serious, heady stuff. And it's in one of those issues that I was kind of talking about. They're kind of light on action, but heavy on character stuff. And one of the main moments of this issue is Steve and Tony in a bar talking their feelings through to two people who don't drink and can't at that point. trying to work things out, and it's quiet and it's sensitive and it's just perfect character development. And so I love those two issues kind of back to back because they represent of so much of the spectrum of what Mark did well.
Well put. And I would actually classify that as one story, is Operation Galactic Storm. So you're allowed to pick another if you'd like, but no, you've done a great job of pointing those two out. I would say, the adolescent Rick, when reading that, maybe had one take on it. And this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, right? Where you talked about the adolescent Jason. And then when you became this more scholarly version of yourself, right? That when you went back and you took a look at these things, you had a new eye and a new appreciation for what Mark Gruenwald did and perhaps maybe the literature that has become.
Absolutely. It was a delight to go back through them. And I could see what appealed to me so much as adolescent Jason, and yet see these levels that I never could have gotten to, which maybe my grandfather did when he was reading them. And that makes me feel even more connected.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of your book. You explore this. So, we encourage all of our listeners to check out the book, Mark Gruenwald and the Star-Spangled Symbolism of Captain America, 1985 to 1995. And you can go on to Jason's website, which is jason-olsen.com, and that's JASON-OLSEN. And you can go on there, or you can just do a little Google search and find all the different sellers out there, because this particular podcast will be coming out in early May, which I think is celebrating the 1-year anniversary of this book, right?
It is. It came out at an odd time. So not a lot of release events and things that I've had for it. So I'm kind of looking at the release. It's now. It's as people are listening to this book at this moment. This is kind of my release party. I'm glad you.
And you're also a member of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group. So we can always catch up with you there and chat with you. So.
Yeah, I got to tell readers, I read it cover to cover, Jason, and I highly encourage it. I think we just scratched the surface on what you plumb in this book, and it's worth picking up and it's worth reading carefully because there's a lot of insight in here.
That means the world to me to hear about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, perfect summertime reading coming up, right?
Mother's Day gift.
Yeah, sitting by the pool, sitting by the beach. Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure wrapping Cap with you, Jason. We hope you have a great success with the book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Well, that was a fun conversation with Jason Olsen. I got to tell you, as a big Mark Gruenwald fan myself, it was a lot of fun diving in deeper into some of the topics with him.
Yeah. What I really enjoyed, and I'm sure this came through to the listeners, was that there were so many things, so many insights Jason had in his book that he explained in a lot of detail. But there were things that I hadn't quite put my finger on. I mean, maybe sort of subconsciously I'd picked these things up along the way. But when he wrote about them, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I hadn't put two and two together on that myself. So it was great to sort of reconnect with the material and to have him guide us through his analysis of some of those things. And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of reconnecting with the material, next episode, 83, we do the Captain Part 1. So we've been doing the second week of every month. The last 3 months, we've been doing the Road to the Captain, parts 1, 2, and 3. And now we finally get to the Captain. Steve Rogers makes a return to his own series. And now we get to see the Captain. So this is, some consider Mark Gruenwald's very best Captain America story. And we're covering these 24 issues over a course of 8 parts. So come back next episode for 83 for the Captain Part 1, where we cover Captain America 336 to 338, which takes place in 1987 to 1988.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that, and it's going to have. Maybe I'll read, some. I'll try to be prepared. Number one, good luck. But maybe I'll read some insights there that maybe I hadn't picked up before, thanks to Jason's conversation with us tonight.
Yep. All right, Bob. Well, as always, it's been fun wrapping Cap with you.
Yep. Let's do this again. We got to do it again soon.
All right. He's Bob Lucius. I'm Rick Verbanis, and you've been listening to another episode of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast.